In the shadowed halls of 16th century Europe, the most powerful monarchs on earth were forced to beg for their survival, not from rival kings, but from a commoner sitting quietly in a dark room in Augsburg. Picture a towering emperor, adorned in gleaming gold and heavy plate armor, bowing his head to a man who wore plain wool and held no royal title. This was not a scene of military surrender, but of profound financial desperation. The man in the shadows was a Fugger, and he held the invisible chains that bound entire empires. This is the unsettling reality of a family that realized true supremacy did not flow from royal bloodlines or divine right, but from the quiet, ruthless control of debt. They were the Shadow Kings, pulling the strings of the known world from behind a wooden desk. To understand how a family of commoners could enslave emperors, you have to look at the grim, blood-soaked reality of the Renaissance. It was an era defined by endless, brutal warfare, where grand rulers constantly marched vast armies across the continent to conquer new lands. But these magnificent military campaigns hid a dark and desperate secret. The kings and emperors were completely broke. War required a massive, unrelenting supply of weapons, armor, and paid mercenaries, draining royal treasuries faster than taxes could ever refill them. The grand rulers of Europe were effectively bankrupt, drowning in the staggering costs of their own violent ambitions. They desperately needed a lifeline to keep their crowns from shattering, creating the perfect, desperate environment for a new kind of predator to emerge. The Fugger family did not start in palaces or counting houses, but in the loud, dusty workshops of peasant weavers. For generations they lived as simple merchants, spinning raw wool and flax into everyday clothes for the local townsfolk. It was a humble, slow-moving life, built on the predictable trade of physical garments. But as they slowly accumulated small profits, a sinister shift occurred within the family's ambitions. They realized that selling cloth to poor farmers would only ever yield tiny margins, while handing cold cash to desperate, ambitious men yielded staggering returns. They stopped weaving wool and started spinning webs of debt, discovering that lending money was far more powerful and far more dangerous than any physical trade. That quiet pivot from making clothes to dealing in debt transformed them from common laborers into the absolute masters of human desperation. The mastermind who weaponized this family business was a man named Jacob Fugger. Jacob possessed a brilliant, terrifying mind for leverage, and he quickly identified the fatal flaw in lending money to the most powerful men on earth. If you loan a massive fortune to a king, that king can simply use his absolute authority to refuse to pay you back, leaving you ruined and powerless. To solve this fatal risk, Jacob engineered a chilling and foolproof solution. He refused to hand over a single gold coin to any monarch unless they signed over the physical rights to their most valuable lands and resources as collateral. He did not want their empty royal promises. He demanded the absolute control of their silver and copper mines, ensuring that even if a king defaulted, Jacob would still own the very earth beneath the kingdom. With those ironclad contracts locked away in his dark Augsburg vaults, Jacob Fugger quietly transformed the towering mountains and deep caverns of Europe into his own personal, untouchable empire. Far from the grand palaces of Europe, the true cost of this immense wealth was paid in blood and darkness. Deep inside the jagged mountains of Hungary and Tyrol, thousands of desperate men descended into dangerous silver and copper mines every single day. They swung heavy iron picks in suffocating narrow tunnels, breathing in toxic dust and risking sudden cave-ins for barely enough coins to survive. It was a brutal, short life of endless toil in the absolute pitch black. These shattered men died in the dirt so that one man could control the world's supply of precious metals. Hundreds of miles away, completely removed from the agonizing screams and the crushing weight of the collapsing earth, Jacob Fugger sat comfortably in a pristine, quiet office. He simply moved a quill across a silent ledger, turning the broken bodies of unknown miners into an unprecedented, untouchable monopoly. That silent ledger, soaked in the unseen blood of the deep mines, soon gave Jacob enough leverage to purchase the absolute highest seat of earthly power. By 1519, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was up for grabs, and the most powerful kings in Europe were desperate to claim it. But the crown did not go to the man with the strongest army or the most noble bloodline. It went to a young Charles V of the Habsburg family, simply because Jacob Fugger decided to buy it for him. Jacob orchestrated a massive, shadowy transfer of wealth, literally paying off the men who voted for the new emperor. He poured over 850,000 florins into an elaborate network of bribes, a sum so staggering it practically bankrupted his rivals. In a chilling display of ultimate control, a private banker had stepped out of the shadows to purchase an entire empire. The man who wore the crown and commanded the armies was now entirely owned by the man who held the receipts. To maintain an iron grip on an empire he secretly owned, Jacob needed something far more valuable than silver or copper. He needed to see the future before it happened. He built an intricate, invisible web of messengers and informants, establishing what was essentially the world's first private intelligence agency. These riders galloped relentlessly across the continent, carrying locked pouches filled with whispered secrets, market shifts, and rumors of war. Because of this shadowy network, Jacob always knew the outcome of a distant battle, or the failure of a vital crop long before the local kings even received word. He could manipulate prices, freeze loans, or crush a competitor, while the rest of the world was still completely blind to the changing reality. It was an unsettling, almost supernatural advantage that made him appear completely invincible. Armed with the fastest intelligence network on Earth, Jacob soon realized that even the most sacred institutions were vulnerable to a well-timed bribe. The reach of the Fugger family did not stop at the thrones of mortal kings, because Jacob discovered a chilling truth about the men who claimed to speak for God. The church in Rome, desperate to fund the construction of massive cathedrals, needed endless streams of cash. Jacob stepped in to finance the Pope himself, intertwining his banking empire with the absolute highest levels of religious authority. Together, they managed a deeply unsettling enterprise known as the sale of indulgences. These were literal pieces of paper, printed and sold to terrified peasants, promising to erase their sins and save their souls from hell in exchange for hard currency. The Fugger agents traveled alongside the preachers, opening their locked strongboxes to split the profits of human desperation, turning faith and eternal salvation into just another profitable commodity on a silent ledger. In the shadow of the grand palaces funded by Jacob Fugger, a quieter devastation was unfolding across the market squares and mining towns of Europe. Small, independent merchants and generations-old family operations found themselves trapped in a suffocating web. When local rivals attempted to sell their own copper or silver, they were met with a brutal, calculated response from the Fugger Empire. Jacob would flood the market, deliberately dropping his prices so low that no ordinary trader could possibly survive the losses. It was a financial slaughter designed to leave nothing but scorched earth behind. Honest merchants were forced to sell their life's work for pennies, watching their livelihoods evaporate while the Fugger warehouses overflowed with cheap goods. Once the local competition was entirely bankrupt and broken, Jacob simply raised the prices back up, higher than ever before. He was not just beating his rivals, he was erasing them from existence, ensuring that anyone who needed metal had to kneel at his door. This merciless eradication of local competition forged a monopoly so massive that it required entirely new methods to manage the staggering influx of wealth. As the physical vaults in Augsburg began to overflow with silver and gold, the sheer weight of his fortune became a dangerous logistical nightmare, because moving wagons of treasure across bandit-infested roads was no longer a viable option. To solve this, Jacob engineered a dark, almost magical system of finance that completely changed how power operated in the shadows. He pioneered an early form of the wire transfer, allowing massive fortunes to cross borders without a single gold coin ever leaving his heavily guarded vaults. Instead of sending physical money, his agents carried simple, coded letters drawn on Fugger accounts. A piece of paper handed to a representative in Rome could instantly unlock funds deposited hundreds of miles away in Germany. This invisible money gave him a terrifying new advantage over every king and army in Europe. Wealth was no longer something that could be intercepted on a dirt road or seized by a desperate local lord. It was hidden within a network of trust and ink, entirely untraceable by those outside his inner circle. By turning physical gold into secret ledgers, the Fugger family could quietly fund wars, buy crowns, and manipulate empires without leaving a single fingerprint on the battlefield. This unprecedented control over invisible wealth bred a level of absolute arrogance that bordered on treason. Jacob Fugger no longer viewed himself as a subject to the crown, but as the master of the men who wore it. When Emperor Charles V, the most powerful monarch on earth, fell behind on his massive debts, Jacob did not beg for repayment. Instead, he wrote a chillingly blunt letter to the emperor, demanding his money with the tone of a boss scolding a disobedient child. In this brazen document, Jacob explicitly reminded the sovereign ruler of the Holy Roman Empire that he would not sit on the throne without Fugger money. He commanded that the debt, including all interest, be paid immediately and without further delay. It was a staggering moment of historical defiance, proving that the traditional hierarchy of bloodlines and divine right had been entirely hollowed out. The true seat of power was no longer the throne, but the banker's desk. That breathtaking display of superiority over the emperor marked the absolute zenith of one man's financial reign. But the architect of this unstoppable monopoly was mortal, and the vast, intricate machine he built was about to face its ultimate test as his health finally failed. When Jacob Fugger died, he left behind a fortune of unimaginable scale, passing the reins of the empire to his nephews. At first, the invisible gears of the monopoly kept turning flawlessly, churning out profits and dictating the fates of nations just as their uncle had designed. The ledgers remained balanced, the mines kept producing, and the coded letters continued to flow across European borders. Yet, beneath the surface of this continued prosperity, the very foundation of their world was beginning to fracture. The political landscape was shifting beneath their feet, as a new generation of monarchs grew increasingly exhausted by the crushing weight of their debts. Rulers who had once begged for Fugger loans were now looking at their empty treasuries with a growing, dangerous resentment. A creeping dread began to settle over the family's counting houses as they realized their system had become too massive, too intertwined with the volatile wars of kings. The bankers had built an empire on the promise of repayment, completely unaware that the sovereigns they owned were preparing to rewrite the rules of the game. The grand palaces of Europe, once monuments to the Fugger family's limitless power, suddenly transformed into the very traps that would destroy them. The kings and emperors, who had borrowed massive fortunes to wage wars and buy crowns, realized a chilling truth, knowing they held the armies while the bankers only held pieces of paper. The rulers of Spain, drowning in oceans of debt, made a devastating decision that shattered the illusion of the family's invincibility. They simply refused to pay the money back. It was a terrifying turning point in the history of power. The Spanish crown declared state bankruptcy, a polite term for a massive, catastrophic betrayal that sent shockwaves through the continent. The Fugger family had built an empire on the belief that a king's word was a sacred bond, but they were brutally awakened to the reality that absolute power answers to no one. The very monarchs they had created were now tearing them apart piece by piece. That staggering Spanish default in 1557 exposed a fatal flaw in the entire financial system the family had engineered. Because the Fuggers had tied their vast wealth directly to the volatile thrones of Europe, the sudden refusal to pay triggered a chain reaction of financial ruin that could not be stopped. The secret ledgers, once symbols of absolute control, became a grim record of uncollectible debts and vanishing fortunes. The collapse of the massive empire was swift and brutal. Inside the once untouchable counting houses, panic set in as the family realized millions in wealth had vanished into thin air overnight. Clerks frantically reviewed the ledgers, desperately searching for a way to balance accounts that were bleeding out faster than they could count. The invisible money that had flowed so effortlessly across borders suddenly stopped, freezing the lifeblood of their massive operation. Relentless demands for repayment flooded in from terrified investors who sensed the end was near. The Fugger descendants, lacking the ruthless genius of their founder, found themselves trapped in a terrifying downward spiral of liquidating assets and selling off the very mines that had built their fortune. They were no longer the shadow kings of Europe, but desperate men, watching their invincible monopoly crumble into dust. As the systemic collapse of their massive empire became an undeniable reality, the global economy they had helped create suffered its first true modern recession. Trade routes stagnated, massive construction projects were abandoned mid-build, and local economies that depended on the family's endless cash flow suddenly found themselves starving for capital. The catastrophic fall of this monopoly permanently altered the relationship between governments and private wealth. Rulers across Europe realized that relying entirely on a single, massive family bank was a profound threat to national security. In response to this chaos, states began to lay the groundwork for modern central banking systems, ensuring that no private citizen could ever again hold a sovereign nation hostage with a ledger. Financial laws were slowly rewritten to prevent the kind of unchecked, shadowy monopolies that Jacob Fugger had so perfectly weaponized. The concept of sovereign debt was fundamentally changed, moving away from personal loans between kings and bankers to public bonds that spread the risk across thousands of smaller investors. The dangerous game of buying empires had forced the world to invent the modern financial state, Beyond the shattered ledgers and fallen banking houses, the true cost of this financial disaster was paid by the ordinary people left in its wake. In the silver and copper mines of Tyrol and Hungary, thousands of workers who had spent their lives toiling in darkness suddenly found themselves without wages or protection. Entire mining towns that had exploded into existence solely to feed the family's endless greed were abandoned, leaving behind broken communities and toxic, hollowed-out mountains. The weavers, artisans, and small merchants who had been aggressively squeezed out by the family's ruthless price-fixing decades earlier never recovered their lost livelihoods. For generations, the working poor bore the crushing weight of the economic depression triggered by the collapse of the world's first global monopoly. The grand palaces of the Shadow Kings eventually became quiet museums, but the deep scars they carved into the lives of the working class remained visible for centuries. The devastating collapse did not just erase a family fortune, it shattered the very foundation of how empires were funded. When the Spanish crown, under King Philip II, formally declared bankruptcy in 1557, the shockwave physically transformed the financial capitals of Europe. In the counting houses of Augsburg, clerks struck lines through debts that would never be repaid, realizing too late that their invisible empire of credit was built on a fatal illusion. The fundamental assumption of the age had been proven wrong. It was now brutally clear that no private vault, no matter how deep, could survive the unchecked whims of a sovereign king who could simply erase his debts with a single signature. This realization permanently altered the landscape of global power. The era of the lone, untouchable merchant king was over, replaced by a deep, lingering distrust of absolute monarchs. The empty vaults and silenced copper mines left behind by the Fugger syndicate forced the world to invent new ways to manage risk, giving rise to state banks and public trading floors where the burden of empire could be spread among thousands rather than carried by one. The grand palaces that once dictated the fate of nations became quiet monuments to a chilling truth about ambition. The family had engineered a flawless machine to extract wealth from the earth and lend it to the heavens, only to be crushed by the very crowns they had forged. Today, deep inside the quiet archives of Augsburg, Jacob Fugger's original ledgers still rest in the shadows, their heavy pages brittle and stained with time. They stand as a haunting monument to a chilling reality, reminding us that the ultimate power to control nations, dictate wars, and consume human lives was never truly held by kings on golden thrones, but by a solitary man in a dark room, silently turning the entire world into a column of numbers waiting to be balanced.